I went camping with my family in Washington State when I was roughly 10 or 12 years old. We were kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and we were in our tents that night when we heard something walking around outside right by our camper. My dad, who was startled the most, got up to grab his rifle and went to investigate. He did not find anything. A few minutes later, we all heard something big again, walking around right next to our camper. This time, my mother got up to investigate. She too did not find anything at all. We weren't really sure what to make of it, so we climbed back in our tents, expecting something to happen. However, the night drifted on, with nothing really eventful, until about 4 a.m. See, it was at this time we started hearing this almost wailing cry, but not by our camper. It was out a little ways, maybe 100 to 200 yards, out in the trees, past our camper. It was a horrible scream, a torturous, blood-curdling scream. Not like that of a woman being murdered, but a man. My parents both shot up from the tent, immediately going to investigate. My dad with his flashlight and rifle, and my mother right alongside him. They climbed right up next to the camper, shining their light into the trees. I remember, I was poking my head outside the tent too, waiting, watching for anything. Something was going to happen. And my dad, who was a very stern, very calm, very collective man, he was trembling. Something wasn't right. My dad kept calling out, "Hello? Do you need help? Are you injured? Are you hurt? What's your name? We're here." Nothing. Just this torturous scream going off in the distance. And all at once, it ceased. I could tell my dad was very shaken up. He told me to zip the tent back up as he got back in, and would not say a word. This was very out of character for my father, and my mother, she seemed a little more pale than she normally is. My mother's Irish, so she's already pretty pale, but this was a different shade of white than I'd ever seen her. She didn't say anything, and I think she slept, although I'm not sure. My dad just sat up in his sleeping bag the rest of the night, just kind of gazing out the tent, as if expecting to see something. I was too afraid to ask questions, too afraid to get the wrong answers. I lay there the rest of the night, tried my best to close my eyes, but I can't tell you or not if I fell asleep. I mean, it's possible, but I don't think so. All I remember is at some point or another, morning light eventually broke, and I remember the sun shining through our tent. When I opened my eyes, my father was still sitting there, gripping his rifle tightly, kind of rocking back and forth, looking very intently. He had huge bags underneath his eyes. I could tell he hadn't slept all night. The man looked exhausted. I asked him if he was okay, if anything happened. He just looked at me blankly and did not respond. I laid back down, expecting to be in trouble. He got up out of the tent. My mom got up with him. Instead of following him, I decided it was probably best to just stay in the tent. After all, I didn't want to make him angry. They were out there for about 15 minutes, walking around. I could hear my dad slamming stuff down and talking in very quiet whispers to my mom. Then, he pokes his head inside the tent, lets me know we're going to move campsites, to pack up now. I just listened to my father. I helped him tear everything down, and we decided to move everything. Now, I also want to state that this was very unusual for us. Usually, when we got into a camping spot, we would stay there for about 5 to 7 days, depending on the location and the weather, of course. But since we did these things in the spring and summer, weather was usually not a problem. But there was one time when there was a thunderstorm, but that's beside the point. After we moved locations, well, things seemed to be better. But still to this day, I always wonder what it was that was outside our camper, and what that screaming was. Before you jump in with a comment and say it was probably just a large, heavy man, I don't know. I would disagree. It sounded different. The footsteps were unusually heavy, from what I remember, and there was this deep breathing accompanying with it, kind of like a large animal, like an elk or a moose. But it wasn't on four legs. I don't know. I'm probably reading too much into my memory, but anyway, it must have really terrified my father, so that's how I mainly know something was wrong. He's a pretty avid hunter, pretty avid outdoorsman, the works. So when he gets scared, that really told me something was wrong. To be honest, I don't want to know what it was. If it was a person, so be it. But if not, well, the thought of that makes my skin crawl. Okay, so I'm writing this because I'm not all that well versed in the paranormal or anything that goes bump in the night. But surely you can help me explain this. A few years back, I went camping at a lake just outside of Salem, Oregon. Me and my girlfriend were getting ready to leave when we heard a loud, indescribable sound. We weren't the only ones that heard it. The people around us also heard it too. I'll never forget the looks on their faces, just like my girlfriend. Now, I know this is going to sound really strange, but hear me out. It sounded like a mix of a whale and a coyote. I know those are two interesting choices, but when I say whale, I'm talking about this low-frequency emission of air, if that makes any sense at all by my description. I hope so. And the kind of yipping-yapping of a coyote. But not quite like those two. It was similar, but it sounded more distorted. Whatever it was deeply disturbed all of us, because my next-door neighbors and our campsite, well, they looked quite uncomfortable upon hearing it, and my girlfriend acted very worried that we should go. One other thing that really caught me off guard was just how loud it was. It was so loud that we could tell whatever it was could have come from a huge set of lungs. It was kind of like the power of an air raid siren, just reverberating everywhere throughout the woods. I don't believe it was mechanical or made by a human. Well, that's just me and my theories, but it sounded like it came from an animal or something biological. It also moved. After it sounded once, it stopped, then moved to about 300 feet away, east, and sounded off again. The sounds lasted for about 10 to 20 seconds. They were long and they were very, very loud. You could also feel the bass vibrating in your chest. It made me almost sick to my stomach. I just knew something was wrong. We didn't waste any more time waiting to see if this would sound off again, and so we tried to get out of there as quick as we could. I'm glad we did. I had no desire to want to stick around and talk to our neighbors about it. But again, I could tell, based off their looks and the direction they were looking, they heard it too. So I know that me and my girlfriend aren't crazy. We've gone camping all over Oregon and around here many times. We have never heard anything like this before. So, what do you think it could be? I definitely don't want to hear anybody say bear, or moose, or elk, or deer, because it's impossible for those things to be it. However, I don't know any natural animal that emits a sound like what we heard that day. When my brother and I were really young, I remember my mother taking us to our mountain house all the time. We hated it. Most of the time, she made us go, and none of our friends were there, so we're mostly bored. She would tell us that it's for our own good, because the air up there is much better than in our polluted city, which is true. Nowadays, I really love going up there. Except now, I go with my friends, and it's always fun. One time, when we were up there, I think we were 13 or 14. I remember being really bored, so I convinced my mother to let me and my brother go exploring in the woods behind the house. We didn't go that deep, and next to the trail in the woods nearby, I noticed a fallen tree that had made a perfect little hiding spot. It was like a tree house was built there, but it was basically just a tree that was knocked down, and its branches resembled a roof, and underneath, there was a little bit of grass. I figured we could bring a blanket, and it would be kind of our little treehouse. The next day, we brought our equipment. I prepared a blanket, some decorations made of paper, and a few glasses if we got thirsty. My brother brought along some toys so we would not get bored. We spent all of our time in the treehouse from then on. We would go back to the house occasionally so that my mother would not get too worried. One day, our neighbor came to his cottage and we showed him our house in the woods as well. He was pretty amazed by it, but his parents did not let him stick around for long. Now that we have made this discovery, we didn't really want to go home anymore. But we had to go to school, and Mom promised us we would go again for the weekend. I literally couldn't wait for all the upcoming weekends, so that way, we could go back and work on our house. Every time we went there, we would build it a little more and add things here and there. About 2 months later, my mom and I went to the mountains alone. My mom didn't really want me to let me go into the woods alone, but I managed to convince her that I would be just fine. As I was approaching my little treehouse, I noticed a black coat through the branches, and I got a little confused because I don't remember us leaving any coats out there. When I got to my house, I froze. The coat turned out to be a person sitting in my treehouse. It was an older man, in his later 30s. He was just as surprised to see me as I was him. He had asked me what I was doing there. I explained that the house and everything inside belonged to me and my brother. The man found it very cute, said he wouldn't touch anything, and he just needed somewhere to rest for a while. He had traveled a long way. I was a little scared and I said goodbye. I hurried back home. When I got out of the woods, I ran and told my mother all about our house and what happened. She was really mad, especially because she didn't seem to know what I was describing. I was never going to go there alone again, and I was scared that I could not sleep the entire night. Me and my mom were alone in the cottage. I just kept imagining the man knocking on our doors and doing something. Me and my brother went to the house with my mom to pick things up. Everything was all ruined, and it had rained, so my mother had given us a lecture about doing things without her knowing. There was nobody there when we went through. No trace of the man that I saw previously. We did hear an animal that my mom could not identify in the distance. It was like it was screaming in pain, and it was really creepy. So we went back to the cottage. My mother forbid us going back ever again or even approaching the woods, and for good reason. A few months went by, and my family was watching the news one night when a picture of a man appeared. It said that the man was the main suspect in a murder of a female, who was apparently his wife, and that he had been missing for 2 months. I almost vomited when I realized why the man looked so familiar. It was the guy I saw in our treehouse that day that I went there alone. I told my mother right away, and she called the police to report a sighting. As the newsman kept talking, I was more and more grateful to God that he saved me from anything that could have happened that day. I mean, I was only a 13-year-old girl, and the man could have easily done something to me, especially because he was on the run from police and I had already seen him. If my mother had reported him that day when I told her about what had happened, they would have definitely caught him right away. But something stopped her from doing that, just like something probably stopped that man from killing me. He definitely knew that I was a big liability, that I could easily get him caught. But yet, he still decided to let me go. My family was very invested in this investigation, seeing if they ever catch him. To this day, that man has not been found, and the case cannot be closed. Even now, 10 years later, I get nightmares or I can't sleep. I know this man is still out there, and I wonder if he's ever going to come back for me. Probably not, but it's still a fear that I deal with. The first time I remember going into the wilderness was with my uncle. He was a very grisly-looking man, built like a brick house, and mean as those crusty white dogs that preteen girls and old people seem to really gravitate towards. My father only let me go with him because he'd sworn up and down that he'd watch out for me. Apparently, a boy needed to know how to survive in the woods, and he thought he was just the man to teach me. He neglected to mention that they were going into the heart of the forest. But the way he all forces my dad to agree, I didn't think it would have mattered, even if he had. See, my dad wasn't built for confrontation or nature. a fact that was made very evident when he'd sheepishly waved goodbye from the driveway, after declining a lesson in manhood and survival. My uncle drove like somebody who did not deserve a license, and the only way I'd been able to survive his neck-breaking turns is by closing my eyes until I heard the doors unlock. When I looked at my phone, I saw that I had no service, and I felt, well, abused. It was one thing to be dragged into the woods. It was another to be dragged into the wilderness with no signal and a rapidly depleting battery. There was no other choice than putting the phone away and gazing up into the heavy branches of the trees that were towering above us at the time. I remember there was exactly one moment when I was amazed at nature and all it could be, but then the explosion of gunfire that made my ears ring, and I instantly wanted to go home. Something large and furry took off into the trees, making a ruckus as it went. He seemed to effortlessly remind me that there was nothing in the wild but wild animals and gun-toting lunatics. His eyes landed on everything and nothing as he waved his rifle about with little regard to where the barrel was pointing. His finger was on the trigger the entire time, and I, once again, began to wonder what I'd done to deserve such a terrible punishment. All the while, my uncle kept hissing at me to keep my eyes open, to keep my attention focused and flexible all at once, as if I were a goat or some other cockeyed masterpiece. At the time, I had not understood why I needed to be so alert, nor did I understand what I was looking for, so I had not heeded his warnings as we dove deeper into the greenery. I watched birds fly from the barrel of my uncle's gun. I typed out anti-gun, thinking pieces in my notes app as we walked in circles. It wasn't until I tipped my head, intending to pop my neck and other rebellious acts of sheer boredom, that I saw it. My uncle turned his rifle to it again, firing before he could think twice, but it was long gone by the time the smoke cleared. I wanted to ask what I'd just seen, to compare notes at the very least, on the thing I'd just seen peering at me between two trees, but he was shushing me before I had the chance. Every word was met with another interruption, another set of shifting eyes, until I finally shut my mouth and fell step with him. It was clear he had no intentions of speaking about it, and I wouldn't waste my energy when I was suddenly acutely aware of its continuous presence. It seemed to dance before the barrel of a gun, fearing nothing and no one as we moved to the heart of the forest. The hair at the back of my neck stood at attention as my uncle pulled the trigger, and the gun clicked. Empty. He scrambled to find another clip. All the while, the unsettling crunch of footsteps seemed to surround us, closing in and circling all at once. My uncle's hand shook as he reached for the magazines that I'd been tasked with reloading, only to find them woefully empty. I'd been thinking, the sooner he runs out, the better. Then maybe he'd stop scaring off the wildlife. At this point, though, I was at the point of begging my uncle to just turn back. This lesson in survival was hardly worth our lives. He had dropped his gun in favor of hastily reloading a few bullets, but he was blunt when he told me that if we turn back now, we'll be dead before our bodies ever hit the ground. It wasn't the first time I was stuck wondering why he'd insisted upon coming out there, if I had always known there was something ungodly out there. But there's no time for more questions, because it was closing in. As I gazed upon my own demise, I realized the creature nearly resembled my cousin. She'd gone missing years ago, and I wondered if this was my brain's way of keeping me sane until the very end. Its jaw was unhinged in a way that my cousin's wasn't, and its ankles looked as if they'd been snapped. Her neck was broken, her skin blue, and her clothes torn down the fronts. My uncle fired, but the shot had missed, and then I was following the path the creature carved out with the weight of my uncle's body. I'd hardly seen her grab him by the throat before she darted back between the trees, content with her meal. I didn't know why I was bothering, honestly. It was his fault we were all out there, but he was my ride home, and maybe some distant part of me loved him, despite his clear insanity. So I traced his trails down to the lake, never slowing long enough to pay the whispers and hisses of the forest and attention. It was only once I skidded to a stop at the lake that I realized the thing had been stalking us was Tessa. She sat perched upon a rock, watching something thrash between the surface of the murky water. No words were exchanged, but they were more than enough to be found within her stance. She pointed one crooked finger to the keys that sat beside her. I did not need them anymore. Take the keys, follow the markers, leave and don't come back. To this day, I don't know what my uncle's plans were for me. Was I his next sacrifice? I don't know, and I'll likely never know. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back there to find out. Autumn of 2008. I was busy driving back to college after visiting my parents for a short break. It was deeper in the night. Actually, closer to early morning. Around 2 or 3 a.m. on an empty road through deep woods and mountains. I saw what looked like a bigfoot, about 4 feet tall, standing next to a road with its arm out, like it was gripping onto a tree. I was shocked, and so I slowed down and rolled down my window to get a good look at it. And I've never in my life been stared at by such cold, calculated eyes in all my life. The face it was making made all my hair stand up. Not to mention it was hideous looking. Stark black eyes, reminiscent of an owl or a gorilla, and a face that would make you scream. More so because of how deformed looking it was. It had scars all across its face as well. Thick hair went all down its body, like some sort of gorilla suit, and it began making these weird, low mechanical screeching noises. I was frightened, and quickly slammed on my gas pedal, driving away. I don't know what this was, and I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I simply can't deny that I did not see this thing, because I don't know what it was. So I think back to it and wonder, could this have been a person? I don't know. Nothing made sense. It was far too realistic to be a person. I really do think I saw something that should not have been there. Or perhaps I'm the one who should not have been there at that time. But one thing that's strange about what I saw is that it didn't just appear out of the woods. It's like it was there and was waiting for me, almost. At least, that's the impression that I got. And the weird sounds, the mechanical screeching noises, I'm not sure what that was all about. I would appreciate it if anybody could comment and let me know what they think, what their thoughts are, and most importantly, what they think that I saw. This particular incident happened to me a few years ago. I was visiting my cousins in New Delhi, India. I'm from Europe, and it was my first trip to the country, even though 90% of my family, including both my parents, are Indian. I'm an only child, but have a lot of cousins, so get-togethers were always fun. The occasion for the visit was a celebration, I guess. A lot of our relatives were also visiting my uncle at the time. My uncle is a colonel in the army, so his family lives in the area of residence designated to the army men and other defense personnel, known as the Delhi Cantonment. The area is largely based around a forest and has a lot of greenery in general, so the air there is always pretty fresh and mostly devoid of pollution. Since only the defense officers live there, the population density of the place is extremely low compared to the rest of the city. The area is also home to many horror stories, including that of a woman in a white dress that apparently roams the streets at night, asking for a lift and killing anybody who agrees or refuses. There's just no winning with the ghosts who wear white, so I try and stay clear of them. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. Anyway, it was the month of December, which meant that the winter was at its peak. The cold in and of itself wasn't so bad, but the thick blankets of fog, mixed with some pollution that escaped the filtration of the forest, covered just about everything in sight. The smog made it impossible to drive at nighttime, but legally, I could not drive back then anyway. It didn't bug me. It did bug my cousins, though, who are all elder to me by a pretty good margin. So instead of nights out driving and clubbing, they had to settle for chit-chat and board game nights instead. Since holiday season was right around on us, we had no reason to stay up past 4. I managed to get everybody on my jogging routine. I pride myself on being somewhat of a fitness freak who, habitually, wakes up at 5 a.m. every day for a 2-hour jog or bike session. And if you're anything like me, you would understand how fun the sessions can be when you actually have company with you. You would also know how hard it is to get people to actually work out with you. But somehow, I pulled it off. For context, we were a group of 5. Me, Danush, Alaska Martin Matilda, and Kanishka. I'm the youngest, and following the order. Kanishka is the eldest, and now the first 2 days went great. Waking everybody up the first day was a Herculean task, but I managed. Alaska was the only one who showed interest in the plan, so she helped me encourage everybody else. We chose the patch of woods behind my uncle's house to jog in. The forest trail was pretty neat, and I was really excited to jog there. Alan Walker's music while running on a track surrounded by trees gives you the purest vibes, I swear. Take the smog out of the equation, and it is the perfect way to start your day. Anyway, as I was saying, the first 2 days went great. On the third day, however, something strange happened. Everybody had woken up earlier, so we'd begin the jog at around 6:30. The fog was thicker and everything was darker, but the vibes were better, at least. We were on a regular path, with me leading the pack, when I noticed something weird. As I stopped to observe what lay in front of me, and so did the others, there seemed to be a bunch of little huts on the left side of the track. Not exactly on the track, but to the left, among all the tall, thin trees. Only the outermost one was kind of visible, thanks to its protruding corner. When you looked carefully, the others came inside as well. It was possible that they had always been there and I had simply missed them. But both Danush and Kanishka confirmed that this was new. Both of them lived there and spent a significant amount of time in the forest, pretty much every day. So there was a good chance that they had been set up recently. The forest has a lot of army stuff like bunkers and training circuits and whatnot. So I figured they served a similar purpose. Kanishka began to make her way towards them, and we followed. The closer we got to the huts, the more uneasy I began to feel. It wasn't something creepy by itself, but somehow felt eerie. There was also a slight smell of something rotting that increased with every step. Ignoring the feeling and the smell, I stayed quiet and followed Kanishka. There were exactly 10 huts, and all of them, except for one, were about 3 feet tall. The odd one was out slightly bigger, at about 5 feet tall, and they were all perfectly square. I could not think of the purpose they were supposed to serve. They were too small to house even dogs, let alone people. The huts had extremely unorthodox butterfly roofs and rectangular cutouts for the doors. They looked like they were made entirely out of straw and were all colored a dull red. The biggest one was yellow and had a whole lot of flies hovering near it. Martin, the curious duck he is, began poking and examining the huts. I was rather skeptical at first, but soon joined in. The inside of a few huts contained some straw and hay, while the others were empty. We were just looking around and when Alaska, who was near the biggest hut, beckoned to us hurriedly. As I walked towards it, I realized that this hut was the very source of the rotting smell. Just as I was about to see what was inside, Alaska began to vomit. A second later, I knew why. Inside the hut was a mutilated carcass of a large animal. It looked like a swamp deer or a moose. I don't know if there are moose in India, but the animal had some particularly large horns, and the carcass had to be fresh. Otherwise, the stench would have been unbearable. Even the blood had not dried out yet, indicating that the kill was pretty recent. Before I could even think about why somebody would mutilate an animal in such a barbaric manner, my gut betrayed me. The animal's lifeless eyes were the last thing I saw, before I joined the others as they puked. While I wasn't vomiting, it hit me. The animal had been sacrificed, and whoever had done it probably had something evil in mind. After we all stopped vomiting, which was a good 5 minutes or so it felt, Alaska suggested we leave and skip the jog to head home. Everybody agreed. We started hurrying back to the track we had come from, which we had almost left the place, when, for some god-forsaken reason, I turned back in the direction of the huts. Don't ask me why I did it. I just did. There, in the thin, fading fog, I saw a woman. She had a traditional Indian white dress and was looking towards us. Without stopping for a second, I bolted. I did not look at her expressions or even her face, but everything had overwhelmed my 17-year-old self so much, I forgot everything and ran. My cousins followed me, confused at my sudden dash. Once we reached the end of the trail, I vomited some more. Once my stomach assures me that there's nothing else in it to dispose of, I tried calming myself down and told my cousins of the story. They all turned white in the face, and we silently made our way back home. In the evening, we told this to my father and uncle, and they made us take them to the spot. Of course, when we reached the place, the huts were gone. Since there wasn't a specific landmark near the place, we could not have been sure of their location. However, we traveled the whole trail a couple of times, and sure enough, there was not even a single strand or straw of the slightest stench of rotting meat nearby. Needless to say, we abandoned the idea of jogging in the early mornings after that. Anybody I tell this story to concludes that I imagined the woman, but I know she was there. I don't know if she was a witch, a ghost, a cultist, or perhaps something entirely different. All I know about this particular incident is it was the scariest one I've ever had in my entire life. I used to deliver to an old caretaker of an historic site in the mountains sometimes. One day, when I was leaving his property, I could have sworn that I had the feeling of being watched, but, I didn't try and pay too much attention to it, so I left, seeing nothing. Now, the next couple times, I would have the same reoccurring feelings. It was like this itching, burning sensation in my entire body. I can't even begin to describe it. Other times, I would have these strange burning sensations all over my arms. I could never figure out what it was. At one point or another, I'd asked the old caretaker if he knew anything about it. He did not, and he thought I was strange for even mentioning it. Well, one day, it got even worse. And at one point, as I was getting into my truck, just about to leave, I had this terrible feeling come over me. It was like a foreboding feeling that something was going to happen. And something drew my attention up towards the trees, where I looked and saw this strange dark figure standing there at the edge of the woods. Immediately, my stomach sank. It was as if all my organs just dropped into the center, the very pit of my body. I knew deep down that whatever that figure was not good. I didn't want to come out and sound cheesy and say that it was evil, but it was giving off some pretty bad vibes. I wanted to immediately get in the truck and go. Also, you should know, there was no real definition to this figure. It was not a person. You could not see clothes or anything that would allow you to make it out to be a person. It was just this black mass, this humanoid-shaped black thing. I began to feel like I was in serious danger if I did not leave right away. So, after getting in my truck, I prayed. I'm Catholic, by the way. I prayed the entire way down the mountainside. Well, the next time I had to deliver was about 5 days later. I did not see the figure again, even though I tried my hardest not to be looking up out in the trees, in case I would happen to see it. However, those burning sensations appearing all over my arms kept happening every time after that one initial time of going to that old caretaker at that historic site in the mountains. This would go on for about another 5 months before I finally quit that job. I don't know what it was, but I firmly and most believe it was a ghost or possibly a demon. Whatever it was supernatural for sure. when my family and I were driving out in the area of the Pacific Northwest that we live. My wife, whom was driving at the time, saw what she described as a very large black dog running alongside the road. She quickly hit the brakes, thinking this thing was going to run on the road. And as we came to a stop, and the dog ran off into the woods on the other side, we were all curious, but we weren't sure what it was. We started speculating amongst ourselves and confirmed that that was indeed the largest black wolf we'd ever seen. I have lived in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California for the majority of my adult life, alternating between locations. I've pretty much traversed the entire 3 states in their entirety, at least for the most part. Not so much California, but more so Oregon and Washington. I've heard of many strange things. Ghosts, of course Bigfoots, but never giant black wolves. Maybe giant is the wrong term. When I mean giant, I'm talking a wolf, the kind you would imagine in a fantasy novel, or like Game of Thrones, like a dire wolf. Absolutely massive. And it happened so fast, it's no reason that my wife slammed on the brakes. Had we not, it would have collided with our vehicle, and that would have been something. Camping in rural Pennsylvania with a group of friends. We had made a small fire in our fire pit, and we were all sitting around talking. We had spent a long day getting everything ready to go, and eager for all of us to go camping together since we had not had the chance to hang out in a long time. Months, actually. In fact, my good friend Mike had been so busy with school, it was finally about time he had gotten off his leash of education to come and spend a little time together with his buddies. And my other friend Chase, well, he was having girl issues. You know how that can be. One of those controlling girlfriend types that would not let him do anything. So, I'm glad he got the chance to spend it out here with us, where he belonged. Now, we came out here in a very rural section. This is more in eastern Pennsylvania. I can't remember exactly where we were, because we did this sort of thing a lot. So, I think it was somewhere. I want to say it was closer to Reading, but I can definitely tell you we were east of Harrisburg. Anyway, I'll cut the crap and get to the story. We were sitting there around the fire, talking, and I couldn't help but notice something big, moving from left to right, just outside the light of the fire. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, maybe joking with me, but I quickly realized that's impossible. All of us were sitting around the fire. That fading thought was now replaced with the thought of somebody out here, stalking us, possibly going to murder us. I tried to hide my panic, but the movements were too deliberate, and not human at all. And the movement sounds didn't really make any sense. They were pitter-patters, but very heavy in weight. As I even finished that thought, all of us grew quiet and started looking around us. My one friend jumped up from his seat, grabbing his hunting knife next to him. I really didn't want to say anything, but I knew that all of us around it had heard the same thing. My friend directly in front of me was pale white. I don't think either of us in that moment really knew what to do, but we could hear it almost moving, quietly, like whatever or whoever it was trying their best to stay quiet and not be heard. I think that alone was easily the most upsetting. I reached back behind me, grabbing my powerful flashlight, shining it off in the distance. I didn't see anything, but I didn't think we should sit around and waste any more time. I told everybody, let's put the fire out and let's jump back in the truck. We'll spend the night there. We doused the fire and all slept in all 3 of our own trucks. Truth be told, I don't think any of us got a single ounce of sleep that night. We were all paranoid that something was going to happen. And me personally, I heard that thing walking around our tent all night long. It never came up to our trucks, which were maybe about 50 feet away from our tent and where the fire pit was. But whatever it was big, and we could hear it. Still freaked out about it to this day. This is an event that happened post-COVID lockdown in the northernmost province of Salta, Argentina. It was summer, and I was hiking along with 2 friends from college, Jessica, whom was 19, and Martin, who's 20. We are all Argentinians. We were driving a car by Route 9, close to the border of a different province. I remember we were traveling by a zone that locals call Las Yungas, which is a term for jungle. The landscape was pretty, and it was just as nice to be outside. Jessica's uncle and godfather lives on a farm in Salta. He was the one who lent us the car, as long as we kept it safe, paid for the fuel, and did not screw it up. At some point, we chose to stop and camp in a place close to the La Caldera River. We were close to an ecological reserve, used by the state employees or something. I can't remember the name, but it had lots of abstract letters for the name of the Union people who it belonged to. We were south of that place, drove to a corner, and entered an earth path. We talked with some neighbors, and they say it was safe for us to camp there since few people ever visited. So we spent the afternoon listening to music, smoking joints, and setting our camp while chatting. The atmosphere was great. Nothing was out of place. But when things get weird, you just notice it. It was almost as if nature had wanted to trick us because the scary stuff started at very late hours of the night. At some point, I was sleeping inside the tent, but woke up after hearing a faint rustling song, like a dog or something was walking close to us. I remember that I struggled to move, but then saw Martin putting his index finger by his mouth, international sign for shut up. And that was when I got scared. I realized that he had heard it too. I managed to see the shape of a figure just outside, and it looked kind of like a deformed bear. We remained on guard until we realized there was no more of these things. That's when we decided to move out and face whatever was out there. We wouldn't just stay quiet while an animal had stalked us. And there was the car. So we left the tent, Martin carrying his knife and I carrying the one Jessica's uncle gave us, both of us using our phones for light. Whatever was out there just ran towards the forest for the moment it heard us moving. It made us feel confident, because if our visitor was scared of us, then it couldn't have been something too bad. So we moved the phones towards it, and man, it was too creepy. It was like some sort of bizarre mixture of a person and a bear. The face, or whatever it was, its features too were twisted, but it had patches of hair and its nose were projected outside and separated from a mouth, like a person's. Like, I remember neighbors telling us about Andean bears, but this was not a bear. This thing that walked by our camp was not a normal animal. We just returned to our tent, woke Jessica up, and spent the rest of the night inside the car, until the very next morning. It wasn't until later that we Googled the creature, and apparently the Ukumar is this bear-man monster native to the Aymara speakers. They talk about it in their folkloric horror stories. I'm a very skeptical person. This is something I never found an explanation for. To this day, I wonder what we saw. But one thing is for sure. Next time I want to set up camp, I'll just stick to real camps and ditch exploration. I don't ever want to see something like that again. There's just some things that are better left in the woods. This is something that happened when I was a kid, around 8 years old. My grandparents live on a farm in Santiago, El Estero province. This is in Argentina. Local folklore there talks about witches, evil lights, the La Llorona, El Pombero, and other creepy stuff. My grandparents live on a farm far away from the nearest town, and there are only woods, rivers, and lakes. The nearest houses are far away from each other, and the closest town is like 3 hours, and you have to use a car. Oh, yeah. My grandparents live in isolation. They preferred it that way. My mother was divorcing my father, and so she decided we should spend a couple of weeks at my grandparents' place to try and clear her mind. My aunt Diana, I don't mind sharing her real name, it's not like I'm giving her personal data, lived there, and she got along very well with my mother. She, after all, is her youngest sibling. One day, they decided it would be great to camp outside. The adults moved everything inside a truck that my granddad drove to drop us off close to a lake inside the property. We'd camp by the shore, eat and sleep there, and just spend our time there playing around until it got late. I do remember at some point I needed to pee, and so my mother used a lantern to walk me to a secluded place. I was young and small, but still remember noticing something was wrong, and my mom saying something inaudible. A high-pitched sound, like a screech. Never heard of an animal like that before. My mom was startled and fear struck me. When you're a kid and see something weird, and then the adults get scared, that's when you realize things are bad. Not because of the weirdness, but because of the adult's reaction. I had just finished peeing when I looked towards the direction my mom pointed her lantern towards. To this day, I can't explain what it was. This hairless humanoid creature was climbing a thick tree branch, hidden by leaves, around 5 meters away from us. Its eyes were shiny, but it lacked a nose, just 2 holes. Its arms were also abnormally large. The creature soon disappeared inside the foliage, and the trees above us started to make strange sounds, as if there were animals hidden above. My mother forcefully grabbed me by the arm and dragged me towards camp. We still had to spend the night there, as we were alone, and this was before the time of cell phones. This was in the late 1980s. I remember Mom made me sleep inside the tent, while she and Aunt Deanna remained outside, reassuring me that everything was fine, and the adults just wanted to talk. It wouldn't be until years after that my mom had finally confessed to me. Deanna and she spent most of the night on guard, because more of those hairless things seemed to appear and disappear by the shadows in the trees, creeping everybody out. They never approached us, but to be surrounded by those things was enough to feel creeped out. To this day, I wonder what we saw. The description doesn't match the creatures of local folklore. It was ambiguously human, a Lord of the Rings Gollum-esque thing. But no human beings crawl like that. When my granddad came to pick us up the next morning, he wasn't surprised. He just told my mom and Aunt Deanna it was better to leave and not spend another night there, in case they got more aggressive. This happened to me back around the beginning of August. I was in my home country, Ecuador, for the semester break. I moved 2 years ago to study in Germany, and ever since then, I had not had the chance to come back home. Therefore, you can imagine the moment I stepped into the airport, and my friends were right there waiting, ready to pick me up and go compensate for all the time we had not seen for each other. It was great. I was in such a need of some time with my old friends, and honestly, we could just gather around to chill anywhere and would still be an awesome time. Well, not anywhere apparently. One of the things they planned for when I'd visiting was a camping trip next to a lake, deep into a natural reserve in some woods, right in the highlands. We'd walk deep in the forest, set up a tent right near the lake, set up a campfire, have dinner, roast marshmallows, look at the stars, and get inside the tent to avoid freezing to death overnight. It all sounded amazing, so of course I agreed to join without a second thought. In the end, it ended up being just 4 of us, but that was fine by me. Anyhow, once we got to the reserve, a friendly stray dog approached our group. Strays are a huge issue in my country, and after receiving a round of pets, he decided to tag along, and we were more than happy to have him around. After the hardest 40-minute hike of my life, don't blame me. Altitude is really an issue once you've been outside the country long enough. We immediately began looking for a place to set up tent. We were walking around the place, looking for a good open spot, when we found a charred, blackened pit. It looked like somebody had dug up a hole and started a huge fire inside of it, at least at one point. A black, tar-like substance covered the ground. It appeared more like melted plastic, but strongly smelt of rotten eggs. We immediately backed off. Disgusted, I noticed something strange. The dog had stayed a couple of meters behind and was growling lowly at the pit. his entire body tensed and his hackles raised. We all unanimously decided this was not a good spot. We went plenty of meters in the opposite direction, hoping to get away from that putrid smell, which somehow seemed to spread around, even though none of us detected it when we were approaching it for the first time. Anyway, we found a nice open space, relatively close to the lake. We'd taken pretty long, and the drive to the reserve had taken a lot of time, so the day was already about to be over. This meant that we had to divide tasks. 2 of us would set up the tent, and the other 2 would go find some firewood. I was part of the firewood team, and the dog tagged along with us. As soon as we were some steps away from the tent, we both noticed something. These woods only had thick trees with thick branches. There was no easy way just to pull those branches out, or break them with our bare hands. Big mistake. No wood meant no fire. No fire meant we would freeze our butts off at night. It gets really cold and foggy out here at night in the highlands, and packing up and leaving now was simply not an option. It was getting pretty dark super fast, and the moment the fog would begin to set, there would be a big chance of spending the night wandering around the woods aimlessly, regardless of having a light. So, there we were, assessing the situation while desperately picking fallen sticks and dry leaves from the trees. This is when we ended up next to the black pit again, which was strange, because I was sure it was way further away from us. And if that was not enough, there was a neatly accommodated pile of firewood right next to it. As soon as we approached it, the dog began barking. My friend and I looked at each other. We knew this might not be the best idea, but we had no other option. We picked it up. The dog ran away. We got back to camp and found the guys with the tent all ready, the dog at their side. He seemed fine now, so we just let it slide. It was getting dark fast. We got onto lighting up the campfire straight away. However, the wood was the worst I've ever used in my entire life. It was dry, but it still took ages to catch fire. And the moment it did, it would last around 10 minutes before it got completely consumed. After trying for an hour or more to get proper campfire going and being almost out of wood, we just settled on roasting marshmallows as quick as possible. We managed to do 1 marshmallow each. Sitting in the cold darkness, surrounded by fog, all of us decided to wear big boy pants and go look for another conveniently placed pile of firewood. The dog did not follow this time around. As we wandered through the dark, squinting around to try and find something to burn, I almost fell directly into the black pit, which, bet on my life, was even closer to our camp than before. All of us stared in silence, almost hypnotized by it. The pit seemed to emanate its own darkness, and suddenly, a pair of wide glowing eyes stared at us from the bottom of the pit. Something was in there. We bolted, straight into our tents. We never managed to outrun the smell, though. We huddled up in the tent, trying to combat the cold and impending fear of that thing jumping at us from any corner of the foggy night. The rotten egg smell was only getting stronger, and at some point, the dog abruptly stopped barking into the night. It was the most terrifying silence of my life. As soon as the sun came out, the fog had dissipated. We immediately opened up the tent to get our stuff and leave. When stepping out, I almost fell once again straight into the black pit. Somehow, we'd been camping right next to it. We never found the dog again, and trust me, we're not planning a camping trip anytime soon after what happened. Living in the woods means you're never going to get a moment's peace. Literally. Birds start chirping at dawn, frogs croaking all day, and wasps all in your grill. The crickets chirping all day, and for the cherry on top, the hooting of the owls will sometimes keep you awake at night, if they're close enough. Oh, and most nights, the wolves also start howling, which is honestly the creepiest. So, over time, hearing weird sounds at odd times of the day became a part of my routine, almost a little bit of a background noise. although quietness and peace are something I cherish greatly. Sadly, that could not be the case since my dad's a hunter and we live in or near the woods for his job. This story is about the last time we had lived in the woods, way back in 2016. This incident shook me and my family so hard, we now live in the city. Not like the city's much better because you hear the noise of traffic and people screaming for all no reason. But the city is certainly closer to the market, and you don't have to travel 30 minutes just to get instant noodles. So that's much more convenient. Schools, restaurants, cinemas, parks, fairs, etc. all are much, much closer. Anyway, on the 1st of February in 2016, we had shifted in our new cabin house right at the edge of the woods. And as per a tradition we do every time we move, we plan to camp deeper in the woods the next day, which was a Saturday. Basically, to get to know the woods much better, we got comfortable with the areas. Little did we know that this camping trip would scar us so badly we would never come back near or in the woods again. Saturday evening, we went deeper and found a flat land to set up our tent. We also started a bonfire, making s'mores, because can you go camping and not make s'mores? We spent hours talking about our life, future goals, and cracking jokes. The same jokes our parents told us when we were young. Also telling stories about our parents, and about how they rebelled during their teenage years and drank after sneaking out. The irony of their stories made my sister and I scoff. We have a curfew of 8 o'clock and are not allowed to date. I mean, hypocrisy much. Everything was going pretty smooth and we were having fun. Singing, dancing, whatever we could around the fire to just let loose. Till my mum decided it was very late and we should probably get some sleep. As per her instructions, we cleaned up our trash and blew out the bonfire. We didn't want to start a forest fire at night. After dousing it with water, we all went to our respective tents. My sister and I shared a tent while my mother and dad slept in another. Naturally, as per habit, me and my sister went into the tent, but did not sleep. We talked about our constant moving and how we're going to start a new school again on Monday. Gossiping about the latest celebrity news and everything we don't talk about in front of our parents, which really wasn't that much. In the middle of our conversation, I think we were talking about Kim Kardashian's divorce and whether or not she's dating Pete Anderson or not. We heard a high-pitched squealing noise, as if two rough metal pieces were grinding against each other. Confused, we both got out of the tent, and what we saw outside was something we believed did not exist. There was a big, white circular plate rotating and flying in the sky. Green and blue lights glowing from its sides and two jets kept it flying in the air. When the flying plate twisted a bit to the side, we saw this semicircle-like thing attached to the top of it. The semicircle was white in color, like the rest of the plates, but it had a window, tinted jet black. After a few moments of just staring at this strange object or UFO, my sister and I began screaming bloody murder. Because what the heck? A UFO? Our screaming woke up our parents. They rushed out to see what was wrong. When they came out, they were so shocked upon seeing this. My dad grabbed his phone and tried to take a picture, but it suddenly disappeared from the sky as if it were never there. It did not leave a trace, except faint light trails. Shocked, our parents hurried us to pack our stuff and leave as soon as possible. We hurriedly packed up our camping bags with all of our materials and folded our tents. After loading up everything in our car, we sat in and my dad zoomed our car out of the woods as if there was a fire in the woods. We soon reached our cabin house. The first thing we did after coming in is that we locked our doors and windows. It would be an understatement to say we were nervous and scared really. We were actually very terrified because all of our lives, we had only ever seen UFOs in movies and did not believe they existed. We went to sleep very shaken, although I doubt any of us got a moment's sleep that night. The next day, my dad had contacted a friend who lived in the city, asking him if we could stay at his house for a few days, until we found a new one. Thankfully, his friend agreed, and we stayed at his friend's house, on the upper floor, for roughly 3 weeks if I remember. Yes, it took 3 weeks to find a decent rental apartment. We continued our school in the city, and my dad found a new job, being a bartender, which he surprisingly liked more. Anyway, he also had more work gossip to share with us. Although my family and I never talked about that incident again, it sure left a mark, since we've not been out camping again. We like to pretend it didn't happen because it does sound stupid. I hope one day I can find out if that UFO was indeed real and where it came from.